Texas. Happy to be bright and happy to be with you tonight on Wednesday. But yes, the topic that was negotiated for me was the New Testament and Jewish-Christian relations, which is something that I work on and write about. Do you need something? Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, actually, and I can even, let me give you handouts. I mean, I actually put together just mostly a piece of note paper in case you want to make notes or ask questions. 1, 2, 3, 4. But anyway, the whole question of Jewish-Christian relations has changed quite a lot, really, in the last 20, 30 years. When I went to seminary, one of the big pushes that our professors made for us was to remind us that Jesus was Jewish. And 30 years ago, that was a surprise. People had to know that or be told that because Christians and Jews had sort of more divided relationships. And honestly, Christians did not know that Jesus was Jewish. It was a surprise, and sometimes there would be a fight about it. But how many of you needed to be told that Jesus was Jewish? None, right? It's basic anymore. I actually had a bright seminary student who said to me, once it went to that bumper sticker, my boss is a Jewish carpenter. Once you can put it on a bumper sticker, then it's just common knowledge. But again, it wasn't that long ago, 30, 40 years ago, that was a new thing. But anyways, we're in a new era of Jewish-Christian relations. I would say there's a lot more friendliness between Jews and Christians. I don't know if as a church or personally you engage with people in the synagogue or talk to people in the synagogue. Have always read it's sort of like much more friendly than it used to be. But I was going to talk about how the New Testament factors into the question of Jews and Christians, and I was going to talk about that under 4 different rubrics, which I put on the notes and questions. And yes. These are just 4 areas of interest where thinking has changed from what it used to be about Jews and Christians in dialogue. And so I was going to talk just a little bit about Paul, the Jewish apostle to the Gentiles, and how biblical scholars, New Testament scholars now think about Paul as opposed to how they used to think about Paul. I was going to talk a little bit about women in early Judaism and Christianity, because that's also a research interest of mine. Because we are in Lent and coming up fast on Holy Week, I was going to talk a little bit about the death of Jesus and how that is an issue in terms of Jewish-Christian relations, and then close out with just a little bit on something related to the death of Jesus, but anti-Judaism in the New Testament more broadly. So I would just have a few slides on each of these, lay out some things, take some questions, right? And again, questions at any level, because that's the thing about talking to people that one doesn't know is, I don't know where you are, but ask questions at any level. But let me talk about Paul a little bit. Again, you all know that Jesus was Jewish, and what was the religion of Paul? Oh, wait, can I ask you that? If Jesus was Jewish, what was Paul? Yes, very good. Paul was Jewish, and Paul was not a Christian, and actually he never became a Christian. If you read any of Paul's letters, in terms of his self-description, how he talks about himself, he never thought of himself as a Christian. Why didn't he? Because in his understanding of how things were going to play out after the resurrection of Jesus, there was not going to be, there was going to be Jews and there were going to be Gentiles who would become Jews, but he wasn't aware that there would be this long period of growth in which a new religion would be born. He was born a Jew, died a Jew, expecting Gentiles to also become Jews with him. So let me just talk a little bit. Okay, I see. If I'm pointing that way, no, wait a second. Okay, it's a matter of keeping the pointer up in the right place. Let me talk about how we used to think about Paul and how biblical scholars used to think about Paul. We used to think about Paul as a person who was Jewish but who was burdened by his Jewishness, who felt Judaism as a religion that was very oppressive. it had all these laws in it, right? Hundreds of laws, and he felt like he couldn't keep the laws, and therefore he felt guilty in his Judaism that he was never right before God. And we call this the Augustinian Lutheran reading in a nutshell, because both St. Augustine and Martin Luther held this view of Paul, that he was miserable as a Jew, and that sort of his personal view is encapsulated in Romans 7, "Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" But then, miraculously, on the road to Damascus, Paul sees the vision of Jesus and then becomes a Christian, right? That's the old view. He falls off his horse. Actually, in the book of Acts, it doesn't say that he falls off his horse, but this is a very famous painting of the conversion of Saul to Paul, where he converts from this old way of life in Judaism to the new way of life in Christianity. I see these slides get a little squat on your PowerPoint, but hopefully you can. The letters are stretched out. But in the old view, or the standard view, Paul was a Jew. Then his name was Saul. He was obsessed with the minutiae of the law. He had burdens of guilt. He understood the law as a curse, and that it instilled fear of not being saved. But that when he became a Christian, he learned that Jesus overthrew the law and saves by grace and gave freedom from the law. The Spirit now mattered, not the law, and that people were all justified by faith, not works. Hello, hello. That's not a problem. I have a handout. It's not much of a handout, actually. But anyway, the new view is that Paul didn't convert to Christianity, but that he was a man on a mission, and namely that his mission was to bring Gentiles into the fold, right? Non-Jews. And so therefore this new view stresses that Paul is an apostle to the Gentiles. He speaks only to Gentiles in his letters. His key question is how to make the Gentiles right with God given the short amount of time left before Jesus' return. That is, in Paul's view, the end is coming quickly because Jesus has been resurrected, and that means that the end time events are soon to come. And how the question for him is, how do we get the Gentiles in? They don't have time to be Jews through matters of conversion and study, because that takes a long time. But fortunately, through Jesus' death, they can come on quickly, join the party. And so his answer is, it's impossible for Gentiles to get right with God through the law before the end arrives, and therefore Christ brings them in. And therefore, I would say that one of the key things that people do with Paul now, that is this new Paul view, is that instead of reading these things that Paul says, which are negative, or often understood to be negative about Judaism and about the Jewish law, they now understand them to be addressed only to Gentiles, so that every negative thing Paul says about the law should always be qualified by understanding that it applies to Gentiles only. And here's an example. This is Romans, famous. Yet we know that a person is justified not by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. Right? In the old view, Paul was understood to be talking to the whole world by saying that, including Jews. That is, Jews are not justified unless they are saved through Jesus Christ. In the new view, people argue that he's only talking about Gentiles. That is, Gentiles can be justified not by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus. And I have a few more examples of that, and then I'll stop and maybe take questions. Actually, I'll do a few more Paul slides. Paul, by the way, is the most complicated thing, so I would start with him. But again, on the left, I have passages that are very famous and often understood as negative about Jewish law, about Jewish customs. That is on the left. For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. Let's see. Okay, your pointer doesn't work. Anyway. The second one, now, before faith came, we were imprisoned and guarded under the law. Right? Those sound very negative about the law as this burdensome, awful, cursed thing. But in this new paradigm for understanding, Paul's understanding, we say that when he says that, he's just talking about Gentiles, not Jews themselves. That is, for all Gentiles who rely on the works of the law are under the curse, or before faith came, we Gentiles were imprisoned and guarded under the law. That is not all Gentiles, that is not all people, Jews as well as Gentiles, under the curse. Anyway, so I would just ask if that makes sense, or if that's puzzling, or if there's something about Paul you've always wanted to ask in terms of what he says about Jews, Christians. Straightforward? Yes, sir.
I don't know that much about Augustine, but in Luther's view of his interpretation of Paul as being negative toward the Jews,
yes,
could that simply be his rationale for his own anti-Semitism?
Good. And should I repeat the question because of this taping thing? The question was that in Luther's view of Paul being negative about Jews, could that just be Luther's own anti-Semitism coming forward? And I would say that's a very good question, and that the answer is somewhat complicated, but certainly Luther was very anti-Jewish. Right? He's got these sort of famous arguments against the Jews that Lutherans in today's climate are repent about. That is their sorry that he expressed those. And so certainly his feelings about Jews in his own time led him to read Paul in a certain way. So I think that's part of it. But before Luther, actually, Augustine did the same thing. So I guess it's not just... I mean, I guess the question is it's kind of circular. I mean, Paul was read as anti-Jewish, which fed into Luther's own anti-Judaism, which caused him to read Paul as anti-Jewish. So it's kind of circular, I would say.
Which came first?
Yeah, which came first. And again, maybe I should also say that the part of the reason that Paul becomes misread so early on and for so long is that the question that burned for him stopped being a burning question for the church very early on. That is, the burning question for Paul was, do the Gentiles have to become Jews in order to be saved? That is, do they have to be circumcised? Do they have to follow kosher laws? And why would Paul ask that question? Because at the beginning it was a Jewish movement, right? So if the Gentiles are interested, do they have to be Jews? And that's a question that burns for him, and that's his argument. But by the 2nd century, the movement is almost all Gentile. The question has been answered. Gentile men don't have to be circumcised. Gentiles do not have to follow kosher laws, so that is all settled. And so, Paul is read differently in this sort of more universal way as being against Jews instead of just Gentiles. But other questions about that? Or questions about Paul on any level? Yes, go ahead.
I'm thinking of Romans, the beginning of chapter 9.
Yeah.
Where Paul. Here we go. Okay, I'm jumping ahead.
No, but you're going to the right place. That is, in the new Paul reading, Romans 9 through 11 becomes very important. And again, in the standard old view, Romans, the letter to Romans was looked at primarily in terms of the early chapters of justification by faith, and many scholars just talked about Romans 9 to 11 as sort of a throwaway part, that it was sort of anticlimactic, or that wasn't really where Paul was going. But nowadays, those people who are working through this question of Jewish-Christian relations and wanting to read Paul as a Jew spend a lot of time on these chapters. And I forgot to ask you guys, this is not a Bible study, so because I was like, we could pull out our Bibles and look at some of this, but since you don't have Bibles, let me talk through just a few of these passages. But I am convinced of the view of Christopher Stendhal and others that Paul, by the time he gets to Romans, and this is his last letter, right? He's actually had a revelation. In his earlier letters, he's quite negative about the Jewish law in terms of what it does for the Gentiles. And then in that context, he's actually sort of negative about Jews, right? in that context, at least in terms of what is it that the Jews have to give to Gentiles. But by the time he gets to the book of Romans, and by the time he's looking back at his own ministry, things are changing, and there are Gentiles in the Roman church who actually have started to feel superior to the Jews. That is, we have surpassed the Jews, or we have replaced the Jews as the people of God. That is, Israel missed the boat, they didn't accept Jesus. And so Paul is looking at that, and in Romans is building up to 9 through 11, his sort of almost the final chapters of his letter, where he is addressing Gentiles and telling them, this quote here is one of the important ones in 11. He talks about Israel as an olive tree, right? It's a picture of an olive tree with the roots, and that the roots of the olive tree are the Jewish scriptures, the Jewish prophets, the Jewish promises, the Jewish worship, right? So that's the root. And then he cautions, and he's speaking to the Gentiles, and he says, Romans 11:13, I am speaking to you Gentiles, right? So it's to you I say, you do not support the root, but the root supports you. That is, so the Gentiles are grafted on to the olive tree. Again, I don't know if that's so new and different or startling now, but certainly 20 or 30 years ago, or even as recently as 10 years ago when I taught undergraduates in South Carolina, Baptist undergraduates, and explained to them that Paul understands the Gentiles as honorary Jews, right? You get to be part of this promise of God. They would be startled, and this was surprising to them because, of course, it's the Jews who need to learn from the Christians, not the other way around. But here is this notion that Christians or Gentiles are grafted on as branches, wild branches on this olive tree, but they shouldn't boast about it. They should stand in awe. These chapters repay a lot of reading. They're kind of confusing as well because Paul is very confusing. But just, I was going to read that last part of Romans 11, verses 25 and all. Paul is saying, so that you may not claim to be wiser than you are, brothers and sisters, I want you to understand this mystery. A hardening has come upon part of Israel until the full number of Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved. Right? For the gifts and the calling are irrevocable. So again, in the face of Gentiles who have assumed that they are now the new Israel, or that they've surpassed the Jews, or that God has rejected his people, Paul's sort of last word on that is that the gifts and the calling are irrevocable, and Israel will always have that. So anyway, so that I would say is the new thing in Paul research, the new thing in the last 20 years, is to understand that Paul is not converting to Christianity, that he is calling Gentiles into the promise of Judaism. And so Judaism gets to be much more positively portrayed. Questions? More questions or thoughts? No? Is that new? Do you preach on Romans? I find Romans actually very hard to preach on and to teach.
Yeah, Paul is not exactly systematic.
Right.
And he's writing in this pastoral way. He goes down one trail and
Yep.
stops and shifts gears and goes another direction.
Yeah, no, Paul was not systematic. He's writing a lot of different levels. He stops in one and goes down in another direction, which I take to be the answer that you don't preach much on Paul either, because I actually, if I'm preaching, I much go to the Gospels, because you got the narratives. But Paul was hard to understand, and in fact, there is a very, some of us find it funny, in 2 Peter, 1 Peter, it's one of those later letters in the New Testament, but he says of Paul, there are some things in those letters that are hard to understand. That is, so even in the early church, Paul was hard. But yes, he's so hard that I wanted to make that point first about Paul and as the Jewish apostle of the Gentiles, and how that has changed, or how our views of him has changed. That is, he's more positive. We understand him now as more positive about Judaism. And when he says negative things, he's only thinking about how that applies to Gentiles. That is, he didn't think that the law was bad, but that Gentiles wouldn't be able to learn it because it would take too long, and so therefore they needed to go through Christ to be saved. and therefore to try to do the law was a curse for them, but it wasn't a curse for Jews in themselves. And I should also say, maybe I'll just push you a little bit, you're all patient and polite, but the radical New Paul people will argue even that Paul understood two ways to salvation. That is, he thought that Jesus saved the Gentiles, but that the Jews actually didn't need Jesus for salvation. I mean, they needed him as Messiah to inaugurate the end times, but that they were saved through their covenant with God. And again, that's argued about. There are New Testament scholars that say, no, Paul understands Jesus as the center of the universe for all people, not just Gentiles. But some argue that he is confident in his own salvation as a Jew and is confident that other Jews are saved through atonement and forgiveness in through the temple rites. Okay, so that didn't spark a question. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any textual documentation that would allow for a new reading and say, oh, we're just going to switch out all people and make it only be Gentiles?
Good question. Thank you. Yes, so is there textual reading for this? We're going to just switch out all people and have it be Gentiles. Yeah, I would say that this is how I would say that people have come to that argument. First of all, these negative things, right, all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. Now, before faith came, we were imprisoned and guarded under the law. And then even back, we know that a person is justified not by works of the law. It was a two-step level of reasoning that made them come to this proposal about Paul. First of all, the things that Paul says about the law as a Jew, no Jew in his time would recognize as making any sense, right? Jews understood justification by the works of the law, and Jews did not understand the law as a curse, and Jews did not understand themselves as being imprisoned by the law. So that was the first thing. It's like, well, okay, this doesn't make sense. Jews don't think of their law this way. And so if Paul is saying this, either he's so divorced from Judaism that he doesn't even understand it, or he's saying something else. And so then the proposal came along in terms of understanding Paul in his context, that, well, he's not speaking to Jews, and so maybe he is just speaking to Gentiles. And it's true, very seldom in his letters does he say, I'm speaking to you Gentiles, though he does so in Romans especially, I'm speaking to you. But what their argument is that when he's writing, he's assuming a Gentile audience always, even if he doesn't say so. And so I think your question is right, because he doesn't always say, now I'm speaking to Gentiles, now I'm speaking universally. But what has been pointed out about his letters is something I can resonate with in terms of my own teaching. I mean, if you were in front of a room or in a certain context, you can say everybody, right? Everybody, should read this text. Or when I say to my students, everybody who doesn't do the reading is going to get an F, right? But I don't always say, and I mean you students in the room, I don't mean everybody in the whole world, right? But if Paul, and in his time, he was talking, and he marks himself out very much. I'm the apostle of the Gentiles, and he's writing to the Philippians or the Corinthians, and he's writing to the Gentiles there. And so when he has these all sayings, right, they are imagining it now more like I would imagine it with my classroom. That is, you can say everybody, you all know, I mean all of you, but I don't mean everybody in the whole world. So you're right. It's a good question. It gets to the heart of it. Is that when Paul says, well, it's the question of who do you mean when you say we, right? We all.
Primarily interpretive. But then I have a question.
Good.
If it's a Gentile.
Yes.
Since the Gentiles are generally not Jews, at least modern Jews don't care if you eat bacon.
Right. Exactly.
Or am I oppressed by a law that nobody expects me to follow?
Another good question. Yes. I like it that you go to the bacon, too, because I always bring that up, right? Because, the early Christians were thought of as Jews, but it puzzled all those other Gentiles, because, they could smell the bacon cooking on the campfire. It's like, you can't be Jews. How could you be oppressed by law that you didn't have to follow? Great question. I would say that there were Gentiles who understood that if they wanted to follow Jesus, they should become Jewish, right? Jesus was Jewish. The apostles were Jewish. And there were actually Gentiles who wanted to be Jews and who wanted to go the whole way, right? So that they understood, yes, I love Jesus. I feel the power of, his resurrection. I want to be a part of the promises of the God of Israel. That means I've got to follow the laws. Otherwise, I'm not truly part of Israel. So in that sense, there were not... that is, the pressure to follow the law often came from Gentiles themselves, right? Who wanted to make sure they were in. And so that's where it comes from. We think that in the letter to Galatians that Paul is battling Galatians who think that, yes, if you don't follow the Jewish law, you won't be saved. And that is Gentiles who are doing that. Because they want to, they don't want to feel like they're half converts. They want to be fully part of it. And the law is so central for Jews in the first century that it's hard for them to be convinced that it should just be, they don't have to. They can cook bacon, right? So it's that sort of mentality, very different from today. You're right. Now, of course, we've got the two separate religions. You know who's a Jew, who's a Christian most of the time. I was going to say there is, maybe in the discussion period more, I think there is more of a phenomenon of Christians saying they're Jews, even though they're ethnically, culturally Christian today, claim their Jewish heritage more. But certainly back then, if you wanted to be a Jesus believer, a lot of Gentiles wanted to do that fully and authentically, and therefore by also following the law. And Paul is like, no, you don't have time. Christ will make you right with God, and the law will be your curse. Good. Other questions? Yes, Tim.
So,
Over Jim.
I guess I haven't really thought much about this. So the Judaizers, or the circumcision party that Paul talks about, those were Gentiles?
The question is, so the Judaizers that Paul talks about were Gentiles. And yes, I would say that it does seem in Galatians that there were a lot of Gentiles who wanted to follow the law as part of their being part of the church. And that goes on for a couple centuries, by the way. And there are, for instance, some periods and places in the early church, there are many more Christians who don't like Paul than do like Paul. That is, who think that he was a heretic because he wanted to throw out, 5 books of the law or most of that law, right? It would be like someone coming into your church and saying, get rid of the Gospel of Mark. You don't need it, right? A new revelation has come. So, yes, many Gentiles wanted to follow the law. Paul argued that they didn't have to. His view eventually prevails, but there's quite a lot of argument about it before it happens. Because even though we don't recognize it, because it's for almost 2,000 years it's our established Christian way, but at the beginning it was a very radical thing to say that the law was a curse or that the law imprisoned you. Because if you read, you can go to the Psalms, for instance, you read in the Psalms especially, but many other passages, the law is holy and just, right? The law is given by God, right? The law is a gift to us, very reverentially spoken of. Well, good. So we got a little bit out of it. Again, I know Paul is the hardest one, and I just getting warmed up. But last question about Paul before we go to women in early Judaism and Christianity. Because again, you could do a whole class. I'm actually doing a whole class on Paul and the law, but I scratched my head about the guy. Not as popular as Jesus, needless to say. Okay, so Jews, Christians, and women, again, I have written on this and like to talk about this, and I find it's generally interesting, I hope, to people to think about this. New ways of framing the question. Okay, again, the old view, and you can see this, you can see it sometimes written about today, but certainly it doesn't happen as much but that now as it did. But 30, 40 years ago, a standard way to talk about Jesus and women, for instance, was to claim that Jesus was a feminist, right? There's a famous article in the 1970s by Leonard Swidler, Jesus was a feminist, right? He freed women from all of that oppressive, nasty Judaism, right? So the old view is women in Judaism were oppressed. And so you can pull up the scholarship, right? Women could never speak in public. Women, in the first century, Jewish women, kind of sort of like imagining a Taliban situation, veiled and, beaten and having no rights. Women were impure, all those purity laws doubly or triply oppressed them. Women couldn't speak in public. And then Christianity came along. Jesus was a feminist that freed women from Judaism through Christianity because he talks to them and he touches them, right? All of those things. And so Jesus comes up as a feminist, and then Paul is more complicated, right? Because Paul has different views on women. But you could actually read, I just read with some of my students, this view from 70s, 80s, just very carefully explaining that when Paul says bad things about women, that's his Jewish side coming through. And when Paul says good things about women, that's because, he converted to Christianity. So that was the old view, and again, I hope you could recognize it as old. We try not to talk about the difference between Judaism and Christianity in this way anymore for a couple different reasons, and let me talk a little bit about that. First of all, we've had a lot of new research on women in Judaism of this time. I just had to make a photo of this is a book cover from one of my former professors, Bernadette Bruton. It was her dissertation, it was revised, and it was entitled Women Leaders in the Ancient Synagogue. And what she did was she collected all these inscriptions. She actually didn't discover any inscriptions because these inscriptions had been known for a long time. Oh, I even put some of them on your handout on the back, on the bottom, just as a sample. But she finds all these inscriptions. They had been known for a long time. Let me just read one. Rufina, a Jewish woman, head of the synagogue, built this tomb for her freed slaves and the slaves raised in her house. No one else has the right to bury anyone here. Anyone who dares so will pay a fine, right? So again, there's this Jewish woman, Rufina, who is noted as the head of her synagogue. 2nd century maybe. Then number 2, Sophia of Gorton, elder and head of the synagogue in Chiasmos, lies here. Again, these are grave inscriptions. That's where we get a lot of our social evidence from this time, is from inscriptions on people's tombs. And third, another female woman, head of a synagogue, and her son, right? So I just point out these 3, I think she collected 15 maybe 20 inscriptions where women were noted as leaders. What was interesting or significant about her work is that, again, these inscriptions had been known for a long time, but people always said, well, those must have been honorary, right? Or she must have been married to the head of the synagogue, and that's why she was called the head of the synagogue or something like that. But she made the case quite strongly that in certain places in this time period in which Christianity comes up, women sometimes did have roles of leadership in Judaism. And more has been done about women active in other roles as well. Just for fun, I also copied on your handout an excerpt from this book that was written between the writing of the Old Testament and the New Testament, called The Testament of Job. That is, it's one of these apocryphal books, where it speaks about Job's daughters. The end of the book of Job in the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, has Job, he's the guy who lost his children and all of his fortune and suffered much under this bat that Satan had with God. But at the end of the book, he's said to get a house back and his children back. So this the Testament of Job is an apocryphal book written between the Testaments that talks about Job's daughters as having special gifts of prophecy. Maybe I'll read some of this. So this is at the time of his death. He's getting ready to die, and he's got the 3 daughters, and I'll just read a little bit. Accordingly, the one called Hemera got up and wound her rope about her, just as her father had said, and she assumed another heart, no longer minding earthly things, and she gave utterance in the speech of angels, sending up a hymn to God, after the pattern of the angels' hymnody. And the Spirit let the hymn she uttered be recorded on her robe. So again, she's got this gift of prophecy, right? Or she's talking with God and the angels. And then the second daughter does the same. Cassia girded herself. She too experienced a change of heart, so that she no longer gave thought to worldly things. And her mouth took up speech of the heavenly powers. And she lauded the worship of the heavenly sanctuary. So if anyone wants to know about the worship that goes on in heaven, right? Find it in the hymns of Cassia. So again, this daughter is understood to have special prophetic powers, special knowledge of the divine realm. And the remaining one, the one called Amaltheus Charis, put on her girdle, and she likewise gave utterance in her mouth to the speech of those on high. Her heart too was changed and withdrawn from worldly things, and she spoke in the language of the cherubim, extolling the Lord of virtues. Anyway, let me just go to the last paragraph, which is the story of his death. After 3 days, Job saw the holy angels who came for his soul, and he got up immediately, took a lyre, gave it to his daughter Hemera, and to Cassia he gave a censer, and to Amaltheus Charis he gave a tambourine, that they might give praise to those who had come for his soul. And as they took them, he saw the shining chariots which had come for his soul, and they gave praise and honor, each in their special tongue. Anyway, I just point this out as an example of an intertestamental Jewish text in which women have special religious authority, right? They're the ones who have the gift of prophecy, they're the ones who sing to the angels, and they're the ones who see their father taken off. And it's texts like this is just one of a handful I could pull in, that have caused us to reimagine Judaism, right? It's not that women never spoke or that they never were regarded as religious leaders, but they had these chances, and therefore instead of seeing Christianity as a break from Judaism, in the way that Jesus is positive about women and that Paul sometimes says positive things about women, that we see that as coming out of Judaism. That is, the new way of talking about women in the New Testament is that if women were active in the Jesus movement, and we know that some were, Mary Magdalene, Mary and Martha of Bethany, Phoebe, Prisca in the Pauline circuit, there's more than a dozen, I would say, biblical stories or hints or references of women as leaders in the early Jesus movement. But instead of saying that that's what made Christianity different from Judaism, we now see it as making sense in a time when Judaism had some roles for women as leaders. So that's point 2. Oh yes, the anointing of the oil story. For the anointing, yes. And I don't know how your Holy Week services go, but this question of the story of Jesus, of the woman who anointed Jesus, I could, yeah. What's that?
That really shows that women have a lot of power in that part, that they're very important.
Yes. Yes, the fact that there was a story of a woman who anointed Jesus before his death is an indication of women having power or leadership in the early church. I can talk a little bit about that story. We actually have 4 versions of the story of the woman who anointed Jesus. And I would say that the story that you are remembering is actually the story of Mark, which is virtually identically told in Matthew, where the woman is very powerfully portrayed. Can I just ask randomly, what does the woman anoint? Do you all know the story of the woman who anointed Jesus? How does she anoint, or what does she anoint of Jesus? Feet. Any other? Because there's different versions. What's that? Yeah, actually. Yeah, it's just for fun. If I go here, I honestly don't know what it means if it's being broadcast. If I can talk with you. But let's pause about the anointing moment. Okay, is it the feet or the head? What else do you know about the woman who anointed Jesus? What was her demeanor as she anointed Jesus? Was she, humility? Yeah. Anything else you remember about her? Crying. Anything else? Do you know her name? Is her name given? There's actually a tradition in which she has a name. A couple different names. Guesses? Okay, why is she crying? And why is she humble? Do you remember? It's actually kind of a trick question, because there's 2 different versions. In one version, she's crying because she's a sinner, right? She's a sinner, and she's crying at his feet, and he forgives her. And then in many traditions, what kind of sinner? If she's a woman and she's a sinner, what would she be? Exactly. Prostitute, right? Yes. That is the most commonly known story of the woman who anointed Jesus, and that is the story as it's told in Luke. And there, I think it's Luke 8, although it might be Luke 7, the woman who anoints Jesus' feet, who's a sinner and weeping. But the story, as you were referring to it, that Mark tells, she actually does not anoint the feet, and she's not crying. She anoints his head. And that's a very different thing. She comes in and anoints his head, and then Jesus says, you've done this powerful thing, and now wherever the gospel is preached, this story will be told in memory of her, which is ironic because the story that is actually remembered is the more weepy one. But the fact that she anoints Jesus' head is striking and powerful because anointing someone on the head, certainly in the Old Testament, had a very significant meaning related to kingship. That is, you anointed kings, right? And David is anointed with oil on the head, and Saul is anointed with oil on the head. The Psalms refer to that. So that she anoints him means that she recognizes him as king or Messiah. But also that says something about her role as well, because who anoints kings in the Israelite tradition? Who anointed David? Who anointed... Yeah, exactly. A prophet. So the fact that she anoints suggests that she's remembered as a prophet who is the first to recognize Jesus as the Messiah. And that seems to be why Jesus says, and now whenever this story is preached, the gospel's preached, this story will be told in memory of her. And I don't know if you'll read that on Maundy Thursday. If that text is read, it's read on Maundy Thursday, because that she anoints him right before the Passover meal, his last Passover meal. But I would say that some women have made much of that, have argued that in the Eucharist or the communion ceremony, right, we remember on the night that Jesus was betrayed, right? We remember Judas. But I know some liturgy professors or liturgy people have argued that it would be more meaningful and more true to Jesus's commendation in Mark to say on the night he was anointed, right? And then you remember the woman who anointed him instead of the man who betrayed him. And then whenever the gospel is preached, the story would be told in memory of her. Which is a little digression, but the question caused me to raise it. But again, I would say this question of women in Christianity and back, right? That we used to think that anytime you had a positive story about a woman or a positive interaction between Jesus and a woman, that's because Jesus was moving away from Judaism into something new. But we can now understand that Jesus was nice to women because he was Jewish, right? That his mother raised him well. And that is as good of an explanation and as viable an explanation for the relative prominence of women in these early texts. So you want to ask any more women questions? We have time. You're quiet, and just a few. Paul and women? Anything you want to know about Paul and women?
Women were supposed to speak in public? That was...
So women were women supposed to speak in public? Yeah, no, very good. Good question. I would say that some people thought women shouldn't speak in public, and some people thought that women should stay indoors, right? But I think those rules didn't apply in the Galilee. For one thing, the sort of like really rigid rules about keeping women separate required big houses, for one thing, right? If you got to keep them in the house, and it required upper class women of a certain class, right? But if any of you come from farm backgrounds or know anything about, lower class people, right? The women are out there milking the cows, right? You have to be of a certain class to be sequestered, right? So I would say there was, in certain places in the Greek and Roman world, an ideology that said women shouldn't speak. But in practice, you see quite a lot of it, actually. And that even certainly in rural areas, certainly, and Jesus' stories are all rural, right? Village, that there was a talk between. We do have in the Bible, in letters attributed to Paul, the pastoral epistles they're called, or 1 Timothy is very famous. Paul's letter to 1 Timothy, that's where he says, I permit no woman to speak or have authority. They must keep silent, right? Because Adam was not deceived, Eve was deceived. We would say that, biblical scholars would say, I think almost unanimously, although of course there would be holdouts, that Paul actually didn't write that's a sort of a disciple of Paul who's trying to silence women. And there's a very similar thing said at the end of 1 Corinthians about women not speaking. They should go home and ask their husbands. But that is also funny because Paul in other places assumes that women are speaking, that they're praying and prophesying. In fact, he actually has regulations for how they should pray and prophesy, which assumes that they are speaking in the church. So I would say there's two minds about whether women should speak or not, that we have plenty of texts in which women in the early church did speak, but there were some people who did not like that. And those seem to be sort of competing views. Yes?
I also think about
Junia, yes.
16th
Chapter of Romans. Yeah, no, exactly. In terms of early Jesus movement and how women were involved, Romans 16 is a very interesting passage. That's the last chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans where he's greeting people. And a third of the people he greets are women. And he gives them very interesting titles. He calls Junia an apostle. He calls Phoebe a minister and a sort of benefactor, or this word that she's called actually could be translated as president, really, that she's sort of like the head person or leader. He greets Priscilla and Aquila, who are a missionary couple, but who worked together with me. So as he's greeting all of these men and women in the early church, he is assuming that all these women are in leadership, and he's on good terms with them. And in the case of Phoebe, the deacon of the church of Cenchrea, he says she's been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. That is, she seems to have more status than him, by his saying that. So, again, I taught in a Baptist seminary or setting for many years, and it was true that many Baptists did not like Romans 16 because if you wanted to keep women silent, you didn't want to have Paul be greeting so many women in that cordial of a way. So there's that, again, we like to see sort of, there's not just one view in the Bible or even in the New Testament. You've got these more powerful strands of women being embraced as equals or as leaders, and then you have these other strands which are more interested in keeping them in place, so that it goes back and forth. It's a contest.
The interesting thing to me about Junia is many translations for a long time changed it to a masculine name that really didn't.
Yes, very good. Yes, you've done your homework.
Because they could not imagine a woman apostle.
Yeah. So in Romans 16, this greeting to a missionary couple, we now think, Andronicus and Junia, for the longest time, and from the Middle Ages. Actually, in the early church, they accepted her as an apostle, but it was not until the Middle Ages when the people who were writing the text actually added an S to the end of the name Junia, which would make it a man's name. That ending would indicate it's a man's name. But you're exactly right. They've actually, it was actually my professor here, Bernadette Bruton, who did this work, who actually, she was a type A personality, and she went through all the inscriptions, and there are no men named Junius, right? And so it was just made up. But again, the idea was that in the same way with these women leaders in the synagogue, that if they're called leaders in the synagogue, people would say, no, they can't be. They must just be married to leaders in the synagogue. There was this idea that if Paul called this person an apostle, it couldn't be a woman. But now we think it was in terms of that. So other questions about women in Judaism and early Christianity? women leaders. Mary Magdalene, my personal favorite.
Mostly the professors and the teachers, or was it all other men?
I'm sorry, so it
Was
wasn't...
it just mostly the professors, the teachers, or was it everyone from
Of,
Judaism that couldn't speak to women? Was it just the professors and
oh, so were there men in Judaism who could not speak to
I
women?
mean, they could, was it just anybody could, did some of the regular men, could they speak to women, or was it all men?
No, well, I would say there were no prescriptions in Judaism that men could not speak to women. That's invented. That is, I mean, in the ancient world, it seems that men and women spoke to each other, particularly in village life, right?
Right.
So we have prescriptions certainly in the New Testament, like commands that women should not speak in church, but we don't have any prescriptions that men should not speak to other women. That was.
Well, there's a lot of churches that still say that they don't want women teaching.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
Speaking publicly.
Yes.
Yes. Well, and they base that, I mean, the churches that don't want women teaching or in positions of authority,
Yes.
if they're Protestant churches, the most common place they look to is that 1 Timothy, which says, I permit no woman to speak or have authority.
They still kind of go by the old law then.
Well, they go by they would, I would say that they would go by the New Testament, certain passages in the New Testament. That is, they would raise up 1 Timothy, which is the one that says women should not speak, and they would hold that up over Paul saying, "Greet Phoebe, the apostle, the deacon." Right. So that is, you have passages in which Paul is assuming that women are speaking and greeting women as leaders. And then you have passages attributed to Paul in which women are told not to speak.
There's some churches, I just know that they just teach, they're just wrong.
Yes.
So that's where I've been kind of like...
Oh, yes. No, there are churches that do. And again, what they're holding up primarily is 1 Timothy, but also Colossians and Ephesians, the wife submission passages, right? Wives, be subject to your husbands. So those passages are held up. But again, in my understanding of this time period, and so, I mean, I've been persuaded by scholars that what we have in New Testament times are these competing views about the place of women. And yes, you can find the proscriptions against women's public speech, but then you can also find affirmations of women as leaders, and that different people held different views on that, right? And the battle went on for quite a long time, actually, for centuries, really. What was I just reading the other day, where it's a 3rd century writer who raises up Mary Magdalene as the most important apostle, because she was the first to see Jesus at the resurrection. So there were champions of women in leadership even into the 3rd and 4th century. I would say churches who disallow women's teaching and point to 1 Timothy, what they have on their side is that the passages that prohibit women from teaching tend to be like clear, like 1 Timothy, there's no ambiguity, right? Women do not speak. Eve sinned, not Adam, right? Or Eve was deceived, not Adam. Whereas when Paul is saying positive things about women, there is more ambiguity, right? I mean, you have to tease it out more. Or Jesus is, the woman who anoints Jesus is, it's a story, you have to find it, you have to know it, but the Timothy passages are just so clear and unambiguous. So that's part of the reason I think they have carried so much weight in Protestant churches. Now, of course, in Catholic tradition and in Eastern Orthodoxy as well, women are not allowed those ordained leadership positions, but they actually, Catholics being Catholics, don't justify it by citing Timothy, right? They argue differently. Actually, it's this kind of funny argument right now that Jesus picked 12 male apostles, and Jesus was male, and therefore only a male can represent Jesus. Protestants tend to argue about Scripture more. Yes, but there was another question. This side? I thought I saw a hand. No?
There are people that just can only deal with it when it's in black and white. If it's in the gray.
There are people who can only deal with it in black and white. Yeah, and again, that's...
Timothy is easier because it's black and white.
Yes, Timothy is easier. Yes, there is no ambiguity in Timothy. Though, I mean, if you want to talk about that just for a minute, let me turn to Timothy, because I like to tease my students a little bit. Let's see. I have to sing. It was actually in a Methodist Sunday school that I learned the order of the books of the New Testament in a little song. And even, I've been a New Testament professor for many years now, but to find a book, I always have to sing that song. Timothy. Okay, so let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach her to have authority over a man. Choose to keep silent. For Adam was formed first and then Eve. Okay, but this is what I was going to ask you. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived. Is that right? No? What are you remembering?
Because Adam took the apple for the same reason Eve did.
Yeah, no, again, it's a contest. You could contest that interpretation that Adam was not deceived. Because if you go back to Genesis, they're both there. The Adam is there more passively, but he hears the serpent, Eve takes it, and they both eat.
I would also test it because it's Timothy who's self-declaring. It's not Christ declaring that.
I'm sorry, go.
It's Timothy saying, I declare it. It's not God. It's not Christ.
Right. I desire then. Right. So that's one way to argue that it has less authority, right? Yeah. But
Then Paul kind of dwindles and goes down the drain along with it.
Paul goes down the drain along with who?
If we take the argument that it's got to be from Jesus or from God, then if we say, well, Timothy isn't authoritative, then pretty soon a whole lot of things go down the drain.
Yeah, well, the question of biblical authority, that's a good one. I would say a couple things about that. First, I just wanted to affirm that I think you're right, that if you read Genesis, it is contestable. It is debated to say that Adam was not deceived and that Eve was. And in 1 Timothy, the language of deceiving, actually, there's this intense, it doesn't come through in the English, but in the Greek, it says that Adam wasn't deceived, but Eve was sort of super deceived. That is, the word for deceived has this intensifier, so she's like really, really deceived. But this question of authority, again, in a Methodist church, I think we can say that Scripture is authoritative, but we have our Wesleyan quadrilateral, and so we get to also think about Scripture, tradition, and experience, I hope. But the issue of how the Bible is authoritative or how Paul is authoritative, I always like to point out Paul's own thoughts on his teachings, which are clearest in 1 Corinthians 7. In 1 Corinthians 7, he's writing about whether you should be married or whether you should remain celibate and whether the virgin should marry and all of those sexual relations. But as he's reflecting in those passages, he says at times, this is a word from the Lord. And then he says, well, I don't have a word from the Lord. I'm just giving my own opinion. Right? Or I think I have the Spirit of God on this. And so in terms of saying this is not God or Jesus, it's Paul. And I would say with Timothy, it's actually not even Paul. It's a disciple of Paul. I think you could make the argument that Paul himself does not understand his words as, that he is channeling God's words directly, but that he's actually arguing, right? He's trying to persuade people. He's trying to work it out. Exactly, that's good. I mean, he is, and that's part of the reason why he goes back and forth. So he's not being systematic, but he himself understands his job to try to persuade people, and he does so sometimes by saying, I have a word from the Lord on this, sometimes by saying, I don't have a word from the Lord, but this is my opinion, right? So that, I think you could, even from Scripture itself, make a case for authority that gives you a little bit of wiggle room on some of those pronouncements that are more problematic, I would say. At least, I mean, I think that a Methodist can do that authentically. Okay, more on Paul. More on the question of women. Question number 3. Oh yes, we are coming up with Lent, right? And the Christ-killing charge. Again, now that Jews and Christians are in such tight mutual relationships, maybe this doesn't resonate anymore. But you should know for many of the 2,000 years since Christians came to be as a religion, and certainly since the time of Constantine, when Christianity became the state religion, the accusation that the Jews killed Jesus was a very powerful weapon in justifying Christian killing of Jews, actually, right? You know, you killed Jesus, therefore all the Jews in Kiev get shot, or, you know, all the Jews in in Antioch or various places. But I was going to talk a little bit about thinking on this and see if you have any questions or thoughts. Again, if you read the scriptures just plainly, again, the accusation is quite clear that the Jews killed Jesus. I write a lot about the book of Acts, and this is a quote from Acts 10. Peter is just one example of a place. Peter's giving a speech, and we are witnesses to all that he did, both in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree. That's just one example of a place where the Jews of Jerusalem are accused or indicted for killing Jesus. They did it, and notice that they hung him on a tree. Thus, it makes it almost sound like a lynching rather than a Roman crucifixion, right? You all know, of course, how Jesus died. Who actually did kill Jesus? Do you know? Is it the Jews? Yes, the Romans, right? Pontius Pilate is the Roman governor, and actually in the territories occupied by Rome, only Romans could crucify. They wouldn't have let Jews crucify, right? So it is Romans who killed Jesus. These, again, are passages in Acts. I study these a lot, but there are countless examples of speeches in which the Jews are pinned out as those who killed Jesus. This is a famous one. Again, depending on what gospel text you're reading on Good Friday, you might read this one. In Matthew's version, Pilate, who is the Roman governor, takes water, washes his hand, I am innocent, and then the people as a whole, and this is the Jewish people, his blood be on us and on our children. Again, in the history of Jewish-Christian relations, which were for thousands of years were very bad, Christians would read this and then go out and beat up Jews, right? Holy Week was kind of a scary time for Jews across Europe because of the Holy Week scriptures and subsequent violence that would come as sort of a fulfillment of this Matthean passage. But as you all know, right, we now say that Jesus was killed by the Romans. Let me just show this picture, betrayed by Judas, right? Many people have noticed, what does Judas's name sound like? Right, it's Jew, very much related to Jewish. Some people argue that Judas might not have actually been a historical character, but that his name symbolizes, you know, the betrayal of the Jews. And I note in Christian art, it's often the case, right, that Jesus is portrayed very Western looking, right? He's got the Roman nose, and then notice the very Semitic nose of Judas. Same you can see, for instance, in Leonardo da Vinci's famous Last Supper painting, that Judas, has darker features, more sinister, Jewish-looking, which is, of course, ahistorical because they all would have been Jewish, including Jesus, right? They should all look the same. There would be no difference. But these paintings arise from the tradition that the Jews killed Jesus. But we have changed our tune on that, and maybe it is so well recognized that it isn't even controversial. But again, according to the New Testament, the Jews killed Jesus. The Romans would have preferred not to. Pilate is innocent. What we now understand more fully from history is, yes, the Romans crucified Jesus. Pontius Pilate would have been the governor of Judea who would have allowed for the crucifixion. But the Romans didn't just kill Jesus. They crucified by the hundreds and by the thousands. It was the imperial method of keeping the peace, right? That any troublemakers, any rabble-rousers, people defeated in war were often killed. And I would just say a word about Caiaphas, who is the high priest. As you come up upon the Passion narrative next week, Caiaphas is the high priest who will have a part in arranging for Jesus' death. And historically, that has been understood as proof that the Jews killed Jesus, right? Caiaphas is a Jew. he is the one who leads the charge in at least some of the Gospels. Therefore, it's proof that the Jews killed Jesus. But as we understand more about the Roman Empire and how it worked, we recognize that Caiaphas is the high priest. But at the time of Jesus, this is not an office that the Jews vote on. It's not an office that is even hereditary, as it was in some periods of ancient Israel, that the high priesthood is a hereditary line. Once the Romans come to occupy this place, they pick the high priest. So the high priest is the Roman puppet, right? And so if Caiaphas historically had anything to do with killing Jesus, it's not in his role as representative of the Jewish people, but it's in his role of helping the empire keep in place, right? So you're nodding about that. No questions about who killed Jesus? Yes. In new thinking about Jewish-Christian relations, we have often switched from who killed Jesus to what killed Jesus, and the answer is then the Roman imperial system, which uses crucifixion as an act of brute force and state terror to pacify an occupied people. I just have a few pictures here. These are gladiator scenes, actually. The Romans loved violence. They really did. They loved gladiator games. And not only did they love going to the Colosseums to watch gladiator games, but they made mosaics. I mean, the rich people put them into their floors. These are mosaic tiles of people, stabbing each other. You have pictures of criminals being thrown to the lions. And I was just going to add a few pictures, maybe it is just the one, of Roman imperial violence. We have more and more understanding of how casually violent Romans were and how they celebrated the violence of their conquering other peoples in art. This is a picture from what is now modern-day Turkey, but it's from a huge passageway to a temple that has like hundreds of these reliefs. This is a stone relief, and this is the goddess Roma, and the goddess Roma is crowning the emperor. I think this is Titus, and he's naked here, which signals that Titus is deified or like a god. That is, the Romans thought of their emperors as gods or sons of God. And what is being celebrated here is the conquering of a nation, and this woman symbolizes the conquered people, right? She's bound behind her arms, and this is a trophy. By that they mean this is a conquered person who is being lifted up to be crucified, right? And so this was celebrated, right? We see pictures of Jesus crucified and we identify with Jesus as a sufferer, but these sorts of icons are built by people who are glorifying that violence, by identifying with the Roman emperor as the power in place who is sanctified by God to bind up the captives and crucify the defeated war people. So it's in that context that we now understand Jesus, not that Jews hated Jesus or that Jews killed Jesus because he was too merciful, right? Or Jews killed Jesus for a variety of reasons, but that Jesus caused trouble, and the role of the governor was to keep peace in the provinces. Jesus attracted crowds. So any questions or thoughts about that? No? Yes, sir.
I'm no scholar, but one thing that I've read in several places is that if Jesus were killed by the Jews for the reasons that we say he
Traditionally, yeah.
had been,
Yeah.
the death penalty would not have been crucifixion, it would have been by stoning.
Thank you. Yes, the question has been raised that if Jews, if Jews wanted to sanction one of their own people, exactly, stoning appears to be one method, or other kinds of penalties. Stoning, definitely. That it was a Roman crucifixion, and even in the New Testament, where it seems like the New Testament authors want to emphasize Jewish guilt and de-emphasize Roman involvement. They still don't get rid of that detail. Jesus was crucified by Romans. So New Testament scholars argue about history, what's the relationship of history to how the gospel narratives unfold, but almost everyone argues, that it's historical, that the Roman involvement was there. Yeah, I mean, again, this idea that Jews would have hated Jesus or been angered by Jesus, I mean, there probably would have been Jews who would have been angry at some of Jesus's more, provocative statements. There are many provocative things Jesus says. He says, remember the guy that wants to bury his father, and Jesus says, let the dead bury the dead. That's very provocative. It's
I'm the bread of life.
Yeah, well, I am the bread of life. Yeah, again, yes, exactly. The more authoritative claims. I was thinking of the... Yes, and he overturns the temple, or makes a symbolic destruction of the temple. Again, I would say that, so he makes Jews mad there, or makes people mad. But I would say that sort of sign, or that sort of action, would not make you subject to death, right? We know of many Jews who did not like the temple in the first century because of the fact that the Romans were the ones in charge, really. The Romans picked the high priest. We know, for instance, about this group called the Essenes. This is a group that went out to the Dead Sea, and they wrote those Dead Sea Scrolls. But they were very anti-priesthood. They were very anti-temple. They didn't just turn over a table in a temple. They just left and said, we're having nothing to do with it. So you could say that, and that probably made some people who were pro-temple angry. But they didn't go out and kill the Essenes, right? That is, those sorts of arguments about the place of the temple in Jewish life would make people argue, but that wouldn't have been, Jesus overturning the tables would not have been a criminal offense under Jewish law. Good question, though. It could have made people mad. But in some strands of the old way of thinking, it's even said that, the Jews resented Jesus or hated him because he healed people, right? Or that he had compassion, and that makes them mad. I mean, I think that's a hard case to make, that Jews would kill one of their own because of that person's compassion. There's a famous biblical scholar, John Crossan, who says that most Jews, on hearing, if they knew about the crucifixion of Jesus, and not all of them would have, Jerusalem was a very big city, and there wasn't, our stories make it seem like there's a CNN camera right on the scene, and that everybody is watching. But in a city of thousands of people, without journalists, without television cameras, there were many people who would not have known of Jesus' death. But those who would have known, most of them would have been sad, right? I mean, another good Jew goes down, right, against the Romans. Yes, ma'am?
Could they have viewed all of his healing and his miracles as witchcraft or something?
Could they have viewed his healing and miracles as witchcraft? And then what was the follow-up to that?
Did they have prohibition against witchcraft and sorcery?
Were there prohibitions against witchcraft and sorcery? Those are very good questions. I would say that in the earliest of the Gospels written, which is the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' healings sometimes show signs of things that suggest that he's doing something like a magician would do. Particularly the spittle. Remember, he heals by putting mud, and he mixes spit with mud. And again, that's how a popular healer, like a magician, would heal. And so, yes, there are places where he is portrayed in that way, but we don't have any records of Jews killing Jews for that. You have those prohibitions in Leviticus, but like in the first century, you have stories of different Jewish healers, but none of them are killed, or that's not something that would provoke Jewish anger. So again, in terms of reading the Gospels, in terms of reading Roman history, it seems that Jesus generated excitement, right? As John the Baptist generated excitement. He talked about Exodus. He talked about the kingdom of God, the inbreaking of the kingdom of God. And he went up to Passover and turned over the temple tables, perhaps. But that would be enough to make someone like Pontius Pilate very nervous and very anxious, because Passover is this crazy time, thousands of people coming into to Jerusalem. Pilate has to come up and make sure nothing crazy happens, and so there's a crazy guy. That's all it would have taken from Pilate's point of view, because it's not like he has sympathy, I would say. In some of the Gospels, and in later church tradition, he becomes a very sympathetic character. But what we know about Pilate from other sources, he's not a nice guy. Yes?
I've read accounts where Pilate had such a short period that he was called to Rome and called to account.
Yes, thank you. You've read stories that Pilate had such a trigger that he was called to Rome. Exactly. And I think it wasn't for crucifying, but he had some issue with Samaritans, the region. But yes, according to Roman sources, Pilate is not a particularly successful governor. He's not good at crowd control, and he does not live out a lifelong term, if you will. He is called out. So yeah, but also his way of dealing with crowds is pretty muscular. I mean, just to clamp down on them. So yeah, Pilate as a nice guy, which Mel Gibson did you all see The Passion of the Christ? Yeah, because there Pilate looks kind of nice, right? And it's the Jews that are really the fomenters of it. But historically, that seems. It doesn't make a sense historically. Jews were occupied. All Jews suffered, except for those, of course, who were the Roman collaborators, such as the Caiaphas. Okay. Yes, I was going to talk. I just throwing this out, which is one of the problems with the Holy Week ceremonies. Again, thinking of that Matthew text, "His blood be upon us and our children." Or the John text, particularly the Gospel of John, talks about the Jews wanting to kill Jesus, right? And then the Jews did this, and the Jews wanted him. I have had a liturgy professor suggest that one possible way to make those texts ring less anti-Jewish is to leave them untranslated. The Greek word for Jews is Judaios, right? And that word is used over and over in the New Testament. But part of the problem with Christian anti-Semitism for the longest time is that these first century texts which talk about Jews have been read to mean all Jews everywhere, right? His blood be on us and our children is said in Matthew, and then that means all Jews everywhere, because we use the same name for Jews in the first century as we do now, which is not the same for all biblical peoples, right? You've got the Phoenicians, for instance. We have no modern day Phoenicians, so you can make fun of the Phoenicians without having any modern repercussions for a people and a land. But that is, I guess, just another aspect of the problem of anti-Judaism in the New Testament, is that the word is the same. And for instance, in the Gospel of John, it's so puzzling because the Jews are always the enemies. The Jews are the sons of the devil, and the Jews want to kill him. But we really honestly don't know what John is referring to or what group he's referring to, because Jesus is Jewish, right? Mary is Jewish. Mary and Martha and Lazarus of Bethany are Jewish. Jesus' disciples are Jewish, right? And so the way John is using the word, he can't mean all Jews. Excuse me? Yes, John the Baptist, you mean? Oh, yes, you mean the author of the Gospel of John. Exactly. We assume that the author of John is Jewish. And that's the puzzle of it, is why he keeps using Jew in such a bad way. I think I have... Yes, I was going to do this as category number 4, the sort of New Testament anti-Judaism more strongly. But if I had to say what is the most problematic passage in terms of Jewish-Christian relations, or in terms of the history of New Testament passages that speak negatively about Jews, this probably would win the prize. But this is where Jesus is speaking to the Jews and says to the Jews, if God were your father, you would love me. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot accept my word. You are from your father, the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. That is, according to the Gospel of John, Jesus calls the Jews the children of the devil, right? I mean, it's the Gospel of John, you're right, is very black and white. You know, there's the good people who are the Jesus followers, or the bad people who are so often referred to as the Jews. But yeah, it's a puzzle because John is Jewish, Jesus is Jewish, and that is one of the reasons people have argued it might just be best to leave it untranslated, because we don't know what John means. He certainly doesn't mean all Jews everywhere. Yes, sir.
I may, kind of be operating from older scholarship.
Yes, go ahead. But you might not be, because you might not be.
Well, that the Gospel of John was written so late.
Oh, yes.
By the time of the writing of John, there was tension between synagogue and church, which did not exist early on. I mean, if you've got, Sadducees and Pharisees and, all these groups, why not some Nazarenes? I mean,
Yeah.
But by the end of the first century, early part of the second century when John is written, there are, in many places, tensions between synagogue and church. So I've assumed that those references really reflect a tension at the time of the writing that would not have made sense at all during the time of Jesus.
Yes, no, that's a good on scholarship on John. Yeah, it's late, it's early, it's late. Now people are back maybe more that it's late. And if I were dating, I would say that the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Luke are late, and that Luke might actually be later than John. But I would say that the places where there is the most anger against the Jews are in the later documents. And exactly, I do think that there are tensions at that point, that Christians are a larger group, and that's why and are more frustrated that other Jews don't believe in Jesus, and so start to get more angry. So I would say that the texts with the highest amount of anti-Jewishness are the later texts. For instance, you don't see it in Paul. Paul, of all of the writings of the New Testament, the letters of Paul are the earliest. And Paul is the one, right? The gifts and the calling are irrevocable. God has not rejected his people, right? But if not John, by the time you get to Luke, or certainly by the time you get to Acts, it kind of is this language of the Jews have been rejected. At least the Jews who don't believe in Jesus are rejected. And again, this sort of language here, not only are, they're rejected, but, I mean, it's essentially saying they're evil, right? If you're children of the devil. Anyway, so that is part of the problem of the New Testament. I guess I would say that in thinking through some of the answers in terms of, I'll skip this one, in thinking through some of the answers on Jewish-Christian relations, okay, now I lost my train of thought. Problems, answers. Well, actually, I just forgot my train of thought, so I'm going to have to see if you've got a question or other thing you want to discuss for your last 2 minutes till class is over. Final question, Jews, Christians, New Testament. Yes, I did remember mine, but go ahead.
I would say this is all hopeful. I mean, this is all good. This peacemaking stuff, so it's nice. It's just a
Okay, so peaceful and yeah, that it's hopeful. I guess I do remember what I was going to say, which is that in terms of the Jewish question, I would say it's almost like the women question in that you've got negative, women be silent, but you have Mary Magdalene the Apostle, right? Or, so you've got both views. And I would say with the question of Jews, you have both things, right? You've got negative, but also more positive things, which is why we have hope. I was going to end, yes, this is actually outside of the Bible, but if you look at the Bible, right, you have these negative pictures of Jews as wanting Jesus' death, as wanting Christian death. So there's this image of Jews as very angry at early Christians. There is, however, some alternate view in the stories of Josephus, who is an early Jewish historian. Much of what we know about the New Testament history and time, if it's not in the New Testament itself, we know it because of the Jewish historian Josephus. But he tells a story of the death of Jesus' brother James, And it's a very complicated story of Jesus' brother James' death. There's a high priest who doesn't like James and he wants him stoned, and the Roman governor's gone, so he's got his chance, and he brings him in and some other people and he kills him. But according to Josephus, when that happens, I just have the one line, those of the inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem who were considered the most fair-minded and who were strict in observance of the law were burdened with grief at his death. First of all, who were those who are strict in observance of the law if you're Jewish? The Pharisees, right? And how did they react to the death of James? They're sad, right? So often, to pick up your idea that there are hopeful things about Jewish-Christian relations both then and now that we can point to, I think this is a very kind of startling image, because so much of the New Testament is this fighting going on between this group of Christians and Jews. But Josephus gives us a picture of the fact that some Pharisees liked some Christians. Imagine that. And we're sad when other Jews and Romans got involved and killed them. But it's 8 o'clock. You guys are done at 8, aren't you? Last question. Well, actually, I will thank you for the evening, but I'll stick around for a few minutes if any of you want to ask more questions. Thanks. And have a blessed Holy Week, by the way. We're coming up so fast. Right? Palm Sunday is Sunday, right? Well, you'll be reading the scriptures. I put a lot of pressure on you to do it right.
It's fast, even though Easter is late. So that's the funny
Yeah.
So let me just remind you that next